Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the main ideas of realism and liberalism in A Level Politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, and some key past and possible 12 markers that could come up on this topic that are really useful to prepare for the exam. From there, I'm going to give you an introduction to the comparative theories and where in the exam and how you're supposed to bring them in, before looking at the main ideas of realism and then going on to the main ideas of liberalism in detail. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updating textbook on the Global Politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics course that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including updating textbooks and essay plans that cover every single part of the course, and they're really detailed. A place to sign up for tutoring if you're interested, and also a place to sign up for some live revision webinars we're running before this year's exams to help you really prepare a few weeks before each exam. So yeah, let's get into it. So first, looking at the parts of the specification this video covers. So this is the 23rd of 25 videos on the YouTube channel, and that cover the global politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics specification. So we've looked at the first 5 subtopics already in detail, and they're all chronological on the channel, so make sure to go and have a look at those. And the final thing we're going to look at is comparative theories. And there's going to be 3 videos on these. This is the 6th subtopic of the global politics specification, and it only comes up in the second 12 marker you're going to answer in the exam. And it's focused on the comparative theories. So the key theories are realism and liberalism. There is another one that we're going to bring in the next video, but the main ones you're going to be using in your essays are realism and liberalism, and you need to know them really well. Their analysis of international politics and global politics, why things happen, apply them to different concepts. And then these 12 markers are going to ask you effectively to compare realism and liberalism in the same way that all the 12 markers previously we've looked at that aren't the kind of the specific 12 marker that focuses on the comparative theories. They all ask you to compare 2 concepts or 2 institutions or something like that. This is exactly the same, but you're going to be asked to compare realism and liberalism, and often the key ideas of them. So how do they differ in their relation to their view of human nature and power? How do they differ overall could be a question. How do they differ in relation to order and security? The impact of international organisations and the significance of states. So really key questions about the international community, global politics, and how it operates. So you need to know realism and liberalism in real depth. All the questions in bold, you can purchase on the Politics Explained website. There's detailed 12 marker plans for them if you're interested as part of the global 12 marker plans. And if you know these questions in bold really well and plan for them in detail, and I think for this topic in particular, this kind of 6th subtopic, you can really be very well prepared by doing a lot of detailed essay plans. And if you know these ones in bold really well, you should be really well prepared to answer pretty much any question that comes up in the exam. Before we look at the main ideas of realism and liberalism, though, I want to first give you an introduction to these comparative theories. So realism and liberalism are the 2 comparative theories that are used to understand and analyse global politics by academics, journalists, and of course students like yourselves. These frameworks offer fundamentally contrasting perspectives on how states behave, the nature of global politics and international relations, the potential for cooperation or conflict in the international order. And while realism centres on real power politics, suggests the inevitability of conflict and a very pessimistic view of human nature, liberalism, on the other hand, is far more positive and highlights the potential for cooperation, interdependence between countries, and the role of international organisations in promoting global governance and really effectively tackling shared challenges. These theories are important as they are the main focus of the compulsory 12 marker question. So in the 12 marks in global politics, your first one is going to be a choice of 2 questions, and you have to answer one of them. And your second one is then a compulsory one, and in this you need to it's not only going to focus on the main ideas of realism and liberalism, you also need to draw a synoptic link to the thinkers and ideas you studied in the core political ideas part of the specification. So that's conservatism, liberalism, or socialism. To be honest, this is a bit of a shoehorned in aspect of the specification, where it often won't work very naturally, but it's something you have to do in each 12 marker, and often the best way to do it is conservatism with Hobbes. But as I said, I'll talk you through that, and I'll make some references to it as we go through the notes as well. So you could link it to conservatism. So conservatism has a very pessimistic view of human nature and often aligns with realism. That's particularly true of Hobbes, who argues that without an overarching state authority to impose order, there'll be anarchy. And realists, very much so, that's a kind of a view of the state But taking that to the international community and the international order, realists believe that if there's no overarching authority in global politics, there's also going to be international anarchy. So you can very much make that synoptic link there. Liberalism is naturally aligned with the views, of course, of liberalism in global politics, because it's optimistic about collective progress and believes that people can be self-interested whilst cooperating and having a peaceful society. So they both share this positive view of human nature that leads to their views of a kind of cooperative society or a cooperative international community, dependent on whether it's liberalism in the core political ideas we studied, or this liberalism that analyses international affairs and global politics. So, for example, you could bring in Locke, who argues that the state of nature, in the state of nature, rather than it being kind of in anarchy, as Hobbes argues, there will be a natural society with peace and equality, and that's where liberalism in international affairs suggests that there is effectively a peaceful, cooperative society in international relations, in large part due to intergovernmental organisations. Socialism is less aligned with either realism or liberalism. You're more likely to bring in conservatism or liberalism. However, there are a couple of ways you could draw links. So its positive view of human nature and optimism about collective progress could be seen as aligned with parts of liberalism, and its belief that capitalism pursues a selfish pursuit of wealth, or fosters a selfish pursuit of wealth among people, and a negative view of human nature could be seen as actually aligned with realism, which argues that states are driven by self-interest and maximising their power in the global economy. So that's how you can use an introduction to the comparative theories and how you're supposed to make synoptic links at least once in that 12 marker in your essays. But let's move on now to having a look at the main ideas of realism. And this is John Mearsheimer here, who's a really prominent realist theorist. So realism is a theory in international relations that views global politics as driven by the self-interest of states operating in an anarchic international system. And what that means is international anarchy is what that means. There's no overarching authority, there's no global police force, there's no state to regulate the behaviour of states operating in society, in the global community, and that means that they can't regulate their behaviour or guarantee security. So there aren't any laws, they can't be kind of maintained by a police force or the justice system with the threat of violence. And realists argue that as a result, because people live in anarchy, states live in international anarchy. States must prioritise their power and security to survive in this cooperative environment. And that leads to an environment where states really focus on maximising and protecting their power. And that means that conflict is inevitable and cooperation is often very fragile. So realism began with classical realism, which was strongly influenced by Hobbes, because you see this very much in Hobbes. Hobbes argues that in the state, if there's no state, so in a country rather than the international community, if there's no state, there will be anarchy. And the fear of others, and the fact that there's no global police force to enforce order will mean that there'll be conflict between people and there will be that anarchy. So classical realism was really influenced by Hobbes and his pessimistic view of human nature, which they saw as inevitably leading to conflict, not only for people if there's no state, but also for states in the international community if there's no global government. Hans Montagu emphasised the concept of national interest and argued that states are self-interested and seek power because humans who ultimately govern states are driven by self-interest, fear and competition. So this kind of negative, pessimistic view of human nature influences how they think states behave as well, as of course people run states. Then later came neo-structural realism and argued that all states acted with self-interest due to the anarchic nature of the international system. So Kenneth Waltz, for example, argued that the sovereignty of nation states in the absence of a global sovereign meant that nation states would always act in self-interested ways. So realism very much agrees that states act with self-interest and seek to maximise or protect their own power. Classical realism kind of came to this conclusion as a consequence of a pessimistic view of human nature, that it would lead, because humans are self-interested and they govern states, it would lead to states being self-interested, while neo-structural realism came to that conclusion more out of analysis of the international community and the anarchic nature of the international system. Okay, moving on now to the main ideas of realism, and the first one being that states are key actors in global politics and the balance of power. So a central idea of realism is that states are the primary and most important actors in global politics, and that's really important. So unlike liberalism, for example, that emphasises the important role of international organisations, non-governmental organisations, multinational corporations, realists argue that states alone possess real sovereignty, which is the ultimate authority over their territory and domestic affairs. We looked at that actually in the first video on global politics on the channel. And this sovereignty enables states to act independently in the anarchic international system where no overarching authority exists to regulate their actions. So realists view the state not only as the most important actor, they also see them as a rational actor, acting in national interest to ensure survival and security. So within the anarchic system, when there's no overarching authority, maximising your power for realists is actually seen as rational. And because states operate in a competitive, and uncertain environment, they must prioritise their own power and capabilities to defend against their own threats. They focus on maximising their own military strength, economic power, and forming strategic alliances with other states. So states are the most important actor, and they're really focused on protecting themselves in the international system. And the concept of the balance of power is really important to understanding how states, realism's view of how states interact. So for them, in a system where all states are driven by self-interest, the balance of power prevents any one state or coalition from dominating others. So this kind of does largely explain why, even though they view the international community as anarchic and view states as always seeking to maximise their power and being self-interested, there isn't always conflict. And that's because there's a balance between states that kind of form alliances with each other to balance against other states, and that maintains peace, stability, and avoids large-scale conflicts. For example, during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union maintained a tense balance of power, avoiding direct conflict through mutual deterrence and a system of alliances on either side. And that's crucially because at that point they recognised that going to full-scale war with each other wasn't in their self-interest. Even if kind of maximising their military strength and economic strength was, actually using it in a direct war would have harmed them. So that balance of power, because there's that counterweight that has a lot of power and could effectively destroy your country, you could destroy their country in a war, or their set of alliances and your set of alliances, that's what leads to global stability. Rather than cooperation, it's not like states come together and cooperate, it's all the balance of power that leads to stability in the international order. As we've looked at, international anarchy is another key idea of realism. So realism argues that the international system operates in a condition of anarchy. So there's no overarching global authority to regulate the behaviour of states or enforce rules. And unlike domestic politics, where governments maintain order and resolve disputes through the global police force, through the police force, through the justice system, the international system lacks this overarching government, meaning that states have to protect themselves in the same way that if we were in a state and there was no government, no police force, we'd have to protect ourselves as well. And for realists, this anarchic structure impacts how states interact and shapes the fundamental dynamics of global politics. Because the international system is anarchic, it's anarchy, states face constant uncertainty about the intentions of others. They're constantly worrying about what others are going to do. And since no police force exists to provide security or enforce agreements, states have to prioritise their own survival, and this leads to self-help, where states can only rely on their own power to protect themselves and ensure their own security, with cooperation viewed with significant scepticism, and there's always worry that if you cooperate with another state, they're going to turn on you effectively. And realists argue that international anarchy creates a security dilemma, which is a really important term you can use in your 12 markers. And this means that in international anarchy, where one state takes measures to increase its security, such as increasing its military or developing new alliances, other states perceive these actions as threats to their own security and respond by strengthening their own defence. And this demonstrates how, in an international anarchic system, you can lead to increased tensions and potentially conflict and escalation as the states are constantly suspicious of each other, and because only they can protect themselves in a view of realists. If one state increases its threat and military power, then your state is going to do exactly the same to protect itself. And this demonstrates how defensive actions intended to increase security can paradoxically reduce security for all states involved, increasing the likelihood of conflicts, and that's where the name security dilemma comes from. The arms race during the Cold War is a classic example of this. The United States would get more nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union would get more, and they constantly get more, even once they got to a point where, after a certain point, they could destroy each other 10 times over. They continually kind of increased their defense measures, as they were ultimately very suspicious of each other and recognized that only they could protect themselves in the international community because it's international anarchy. A final key idea then is the inevitability of war. So realists believe that war is an inevitable feature of the anarchic international system. They argue that the absence of a global police force, global government, global authority, whatever you want to call it, to enforce rules and mediate disputes, creates a world where conflicts over power and resources of security are bound to arise. War is an abnormal, but is an inevitable outcome of the competitive dynamics of global politics. So everything we've looked at so far, the fact that there's international anarchy, the fact that states are the primary actor in global politics, and the fact that they can only protect themselves and seek to increase their military power, leads to war being inevitable. So states as self-interested actors are driven by the pursuit of power and the need to ensure their own survival. And this often brings states into conflict with one another, as the gains of one state can threaten the security of other. And that means that they see power as zero, they see power in zero-sum terms. That means that if one state increases its power, that has to be taking power away from another state or threatening the other state. And that means that states always have to be prepared to defend their interests, even through the use of force. Realists emphasise the limits of international institutions and treaties in preventing war. As for them, without a global authority to enforce agreements, states simply abandon treaties and act unilaterally when it suits their interests. For example, the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, as great powers including Germany, Japan, Great Britain and France sought to maximise their power and came into conflict as a result. So Christian, we'll look at this more in the next video, but realists really argue that states are the most important actor. International governmental organisations or other international actors really have no power in the international system, and international community to compel states to do anything, and therefore states can just go to war irrespective of what an international governmental organisation does, or even if it tells it not to do so. Moving on now to the main ideas of liberalism, which, as you'll see, offers a very stark contrast to realism, focusing on the capacity of states to work together for mutual benefit. So they don't see the international community as a kind of zero-sum game, where one state increasing their power results in another state losing their power. Instead, they say that the states can work together and increase all of their own power together, and therefore improve outcomes for every state and their citizens. It's rooted in a really optimistic view of human nature, and it sees individuals, and as a result states, because individuals run states, as capable of reason, morality, and cooperation to reach shared goals. Unlike realism, it doesn't view the state as the only actor in global politics, the only important actor in global politics. Instead, it believes that states are one of many actors that shape global affairs, and really focuses on the importance of international organisations, non-governmental organisations, and multinational corporations in shaping global politics. These non-state actors can play an important role in creating global norms, enforcing international law, and fostering cooperation between states. The philosophical foundations of liberalism are closely tied to kind of the liberalism we looked at in the core ideas, and the ideas of John Locke and classical liberalism in particular, who argued that humans are inherently rational and capable of coexisting in a natural society governed by laws and mutual agreements, even if there isn't an overarching state, and in this case, an overarching government, kind of global government. In this realm of international relations, this optimism translates into a belief that states can transcend conflict, and that the international community isn't defined by constant competition. It can be defined by cooperation through diplomacy, trade, and the establishment of international norms and institutions. So looking at the first key idea, and that's the significance of morality and optimism on human nature. So central to liberalism is the belief in the moral capacity of individuals and states. So realists have a very pessimistic view of human nature. Liberals, on the other hand, have a positive view of human nature. And they argue that individuals, and therefore states, aren't driven just by self-interest and the pursuit of power. They're also motivated by ideals of justice, upholding values, and working together to help each other. And this optimism about human nature underpins a liberal view that international relations aren't doomed to perpetual conflict, as realists argued. So they maintain that through reason and dialogue, states can resolve disputes. It doesn't always lead to war. They don't believe in the inevitability of war like realists argue. And instead they can kind of cooperate and solve disputes and also work together. So rather than simply ignoring international law and agreements, which realists argue that states do, and realists argue that these agreements really have no impact and states just do what they want anyway, liberals argue that they generally adhere to international law, even in the absence of a global police force to enforce them. And they argue that states recognise the long-term benefits of a rules-based international order and the stability it provides. So this belief in the potential for moral progress also drives liberal support for democracy and human rights. They believe that these values can be promoted by the international community to create a more peaceful and cooperative world. So their positive vision of human nature kind of that came up from classical liberalism and the idea of a natural society, the Locke's idea of a natural society, the idea of that humans are rational and self-interested, leads to them viewing states in these terms and believing that the international community can work together through cooperation and doesn't inevitably lead to competition, conflict, and war. And that's, of course, linked in very much here, the possibility of harmony and balance. So realism emphasises conflict as inevitable, as we thought, but liberalism disagrees and sees states and other actors as capable of working together to create a stable and peaceful international system. So one of the key beliefs of liberalism, as I went through a few minutes ago, is the belief that states aren't always in zero-sum competition. Instead, they can pursue positive sum outcomes. So it's not that one state increasing its power always damages another state and results in them losing power. Instead, states could work together to improve each other's outcomes together, and that's positive sum outcomes through cooperation. And this is evident in areas like free trade, where liberal theorists argue that economic interdependence benefits all parties by encouraging states to prioritise economic growth and stability and collaboration over conflict. Liberalism also argues that shared values such as democracy, human rights, and the rule of law can create a foundation for trust and collaboration among states in the international community. They don't always naturally have to distrust each other and therefore lead to competition and second guess each other, as realists argue in the security dilemma. The democratic peace theory, for example, argues that democracies are less likely to go to war with one another because they share systems of governance and values that favour negotiation and compromise over aggression. And this reinforces the liberal belief that balance and harmony in international relations are not only possible but also achievable through the spread of these liberal ideas of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And that also links into their view of complex independence, which argues that the deep connections between states through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange in the modern world, which we looked at when we looked at globalization, so it's very much linked to globalization. And this kind of results in the fact that cooperation is not just necessary, it's desirable as states can pursue shared challenges. So because economies are so interlinked, if they go to war, they really damage each other. Of course, that always happened, but the damage is so much greater and they damage the whole of the international community. And that leads to more cooperation rather than conflict. So complex interdependence suggests that states are no longer isolated actors operating solely to maximise their power in a competitive system. Instead, their interests are deeply connected due to how interdependent their economies are. So global supply chains, for example, mean that economic prosperity in one state often depends on stability and cooperation with others. And this discourages conflict for all states, as if there's conflict in one part of the world, that really influences the whole of the world. For example, you could look at an example of that as the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't just influence Ukraine, it influenced energy prices across the world and food security, and had really transformative effects. And liberals argue that this actually discourages war. This kind of deep interdependence and interlinking of countries discourages war. Moreover, complex interdependence highlights the growing role of non-state actors, such as multinational corporations, international governmental organisations, and non-governmental organisations in shaping global politics, as these organisations kind of foster cooperation between states that transcends borders, including to tackle kind of shared global challenges such as climate change and international trade. The next key liberal idea we're going to have a look at is the likelihood of global governance. So unlike realists, which argue that the kind of competition between states, meaning that there can never be cooperation, never be kind of peace and effective and stable global order, liberalism really disagrees and asserts that global governance is both possible and necessary for addressing complex international issues. So realists view the absence of central authority as a permanent feature of an anarchic international system and argue that intergovernmental organisations have very little power. So there's no real global governance that has any power for realists. Liberals really disagree and argue that states and these non-state actors can collaborate to create rules and institutions that regulate behaviour and create a stable international system. So global governance involves cooperation among states, IGOs and NGOs to manage shared challenges such as international trade, climate change and security. And liberals believe that states recognise the benefits of working together within these frameworks, even if they're not coerced into doing so, and as a result recognise the benefits of a global government and decide to implement international law even if they're not coerced to do so. For example, under the Paris Agreement, states voluntarily commit to reduce emissions and tackling climate change, even if it isn't in all of their direct interests. Liberals crucially also highlight the role of international law in reducing conflict. So realists argue that international law has no power at all, and states just do what they want anyway. But liberals disagree and argue that the establishment of international law and rules can reduce uncertainty and build trust between states, as states do ultimately abide by international law the majority of the time. And finally, liberals, we've referenced this a number of times, but liberals see international organisations as central to global politics, unlike realism, which sees them as having no power. For liberals, these organisations provide platforms for dialogue, foster economic and political collaboration, and promote collective action to address global challenges. They argue that international organisations are a central part of global governance rather than having no real power, and they not only facilitate cooperation, but also create norms that really shape state behaviour. Realists argue that they lack the power to enforce decisions and that states comply only with their rules when it serves their interests, but liberals counter these and argue that these organisations build trust and stability over time and create a rules-based international order where all states largely follow the rules and are incentivised to do so. Hopefully that was useful. That was the main ideas of realism and liberalism. There's going to be 2 more videos on comparative theories. The next one's going to look at the key divisions between realism and liberalism, where we're going to cover these a lot again. So if you didn't get any of them or understand any of them completely, make sure to watch that next video. And then we're going to finish it off by looking at how realism and liberalism explain recent developments in global politics, which is going to be really useful for those 12 markers in the exam as well. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.